The road was little more than a scar of wagon ruts across the prairie, half swallowed by dust and time. Elias Crowe guided his mare with the slow certainty of a man who had traveled too far, too often, and no longer expected surprise at the end of a journey. His hands, cracked and scarred from years of rope and shovel, rested loose on the reins. He did not ride with hurry. Peace was never found in haste. By the time the cabin came into sight, the winter sun was already sinking low, a thin gold washed in gray. From a distance, the place looked as he imagined, weathered, leaning, built from logs that bore the dark polish of rain and seasons. It was not much, but it was enough. A man did not need much when his children were buried, and his wife's rocking chair sat empty. He dismounted with a slow grunt, boots sinking into frosted earth. The cabin sat on a rise overlooking a stand of cottonwoods stripped bare by the cold. A stream murmured somewhere close, though its voice was thin beneath the weight of approaching winter. He climbed the step and placed his hand against the door. It did not move. The door was barred from within. And as he stood there, frowning at the rough-hewn planks, the scent of wood smoke reached him. Not the stale ash of a place abandoned, but the sharp, living smoke of a fire that still breathed. Elias's brows knit. His purchase had come through a trader in town who swore the land stood empty. He knocked once, a slow thud against the door. Silence answered. He knocked again. At last, a voice spoke. "You should not come here." The words were low, steady, carried through the wood with the weight of belonging. Elias straightened, his jaw tightening. "This cabin's mine. Paid for it in full. Papers signed." A pause. Then the scrape of a bar sliding free. The door opened a narrow span, and in its shadow stood a woman. Her hair, long and black streaked faintly with silver, fell loose about her shoulders. A faded shawl wrapped her frame, the wool frayed at the edges but clutched close as armor. Her face bore lines not of age alone but of endurance, the hard-carved marks of weather and grief. Her eyes fixed on him with the guarded fire of someone who had defended every inch of ground she still stood upon. "I am Nayeli," she said at last. Her voice quiet but unyielding. "This place has kept me alive. Longer than paper. Longer than law." Elias removed his hat, though not out of courtesy alone. Something in her gaze commanded honesty, the kind of honesty that made a man restless in his own skin. "I don't aim for trouble. I bought this place fair. Expected it to be empty. It is not empty," she said simply. And with that she stepped back, opening the door enough to let him enter, not with welcome, but with the cool inevitability of weather. Inside, the cabin bore signs of life. A low fire glowed in the hearth, its light painting the rough logs in copper. Herbs hung from the rafters, drying slowly in the heat. A pot simmered faintly, though the scent was more of survival than comfort. Boiled roots, perhaps, a trace of venison bone. The room was clean, but sparse, each object worn by long use. Elias's boots thudded against the plank floor as he crossed the threshold. He felt the weight of her eyes upon him, steady, watchful. He laid his pack in the corner, rested his rifle against the wall, and took in the place that was meant to be his. The hearth, the table with its uneven legs, the single chair polished smooth by time. "You've been here long?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Nayeli turned back to the fire, adjusting the pot. The flames lit the curve of her cheek, the strand of hair fallen loose across it. "Long enough to have nowhere else." Elias set his hat upon the table. He was not a man to be moved by little. He had seen death on too many doorsteps, famine ride with winter, and justice bent until it broke. Yet standing in that cabin, the presence of this woman unsettled him more than a band of armed riders might have. Her calm, her refusal to bow or beg, was resistance stronger than any barricade. "You know this land was sold," he said, his voice low. "And you know a man's sail does not wash away another's grave." Her tone did not rise, but the words cut clean. She looked at him then, fully, her eyes dark with a grief that had been pressed into strength. "This is not only yours." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the hiss of firewood. Elias could have driven her out. He had the right by law, by coin, by the ink on papers drawn up by men who never set foot here. Yet something in her gaze stilled him. Not fear, not defiance, but the weight of one who had been left too many times and survived still. He lowered himself onto the chair, its wood creaking beneath him. The warmth of the hearth touched his hands, stiff with cold. "Then it seems we've got a problem," he said quietly. Nayeli did not answer. She turned back to the hearth, lifted a ladle, and poured thin broth into a clay bowl. She set it on the table between them, the gesture neither kindness nor surrender. Only necessity. Elias studied the bowl, steam rising in the dim light. He felt the ache of his bones, the long road behind him, the silence of too many nights alone. He picked up the spoon and ate. For a long time they said nothing more. The fire cracked, the wind pressed against the shutters, and two lives, long isolated, sat within the same walls, not joined, not reconciled, but colliding in the cold space between survival and belonging. Elias Crowe had come seeking peace in the shelter of timber and stone. Instead, he found a woman whose silence was fiercer than protest, and whose claim upon the place was older than his coin. He knew then that this cabin would not deliver the rest he had imagined. It would awaken wounds he thought buried, and yet, as the night deepened and the fire settled into coals, he did not rise to leave. The welcome was cold as the wind rattling the shutters. But it was real. The days unfolded with a silence that seemed stitched into the very grain of the cabin walls. Elias Crowe rose before dawn as he always had and stepped out into the pale frost. The land stretched wide and indifferent, its silence broken only by the creak of his boots on frozen ground, the thud of an axe biting into wood, the slow trickle of water hauled from the stream. Each task was simple, but necessity had its own rhythm, a rhythm Elias trusted. Nayeli's rhythm was different. She moved quietly through the cabin like smoke curling from the chimney, never still for long, never loud. Her shawl, worn but sturdy, trailed as she bent to sweep the floor, to mend a hem, to stir the coals back to life. Sometimes she sat in the dim light, her long black hair in her hands, weaving it into a braid with the same care as if she were binding together memories too fragile to let loose. They spoke little. Words were not wasted, though silence between them was heavy, taut as a rope pulled tight. Yet each movement spoke. When Elias cut wood, she gathered the splinters for kindling. When Nayeli drew water, he carried the bucket the rest of the way. Neither asked. Neither thanked. Still, in those wordless exchanges, something unspoken stirred. But the shadows came easily. When Elias entered the cabin each night, bone-weary from work, his eyes strayed to the corner where a rocking chair should have been. His late wife's chair. It had sat in every home they had built together, its creak a comfort in long evenings. Now the space was empty, the memory of its sound louder than the silence that replaced it. He carried the absence like a weight, one more tool he could not set down. Nayeli, too, sat in her own shadows. At night, her dreams carried her back to the band she had once walked with. Her family's voices rising with the dawn, the rhythm of drums and laughter around firelight. But when she woke, there was only the dim glow of embers, the shawl around her shoulders, and the sharp truth that they were gone. Raids had scattered them, sickness had taken others. Her shawl was the last thread, worn soft by years of holding on. She braided her hair not for vanity, but as a tether to the women who had once braided it for her. For a time, they lived like two ghosts inhabiting the same ground, each wrapped in loss, each unwilling to trespass into the other's silence. One night, the storm came. It rose from the west, sudden and fierce, wind howling through the cottonwoods, rattling the shutters until the nails groaned. Rain lashed against the roof in heavy sheets. The fire inside guttered and flared, the flames bending as if fearful. Elias checked the latch on the door, then stood by the window, watching water streak down the glass. He felt the storm in his bones, not just the weight of weather, but the gathering of something long held back. Nayeli sat near the fire, her shawl drawn close. She stirred the pot slowly, though the food inside had long since cooked. Her eyes were on the flames, yet distant, as if she saw some other fire from years before. The silence grew unbearable, loud as the storm outside. Elias turned from the window, his jaw tight, his hand resting on the back of the chair as if steadying himself. "I didn't buy this place for profit," he said at last. His voice was rough, as though dragged up from somewhere long buried. "I don't need land for cattle, don't need fields to sow. I bought it because I've been wandering too many years. Thought maybe here I could rest. Thought maybe I could stop hearing her voice every time I closed my eyes." Nayeli looked up, the firelight catching in her eyes. She did not ask who her was. She did not need to. The way his shoulders bent, the way his gaze dropped toward the empty rocking chair corner. The truth was already there. "I buried her 3 winters back," Elias continued, his words halting, as if each one carried a stone's weight. "Since then, every roof feels borrowed, every bed too cold. I thought this place would be different, but it ain't. Not yet." The storm raged louder, wind clawing at the walls. Nayeli's fingers tightened on the spoon, then loosened again. She turned back to the fire, her voice steady, but low. "I have nowhere else," she said. "When the raids ended, when sickness came, I was left. My people were gone. The land was the only thing that remembered me. This cabin, this fire, they are not mine by paper, but they are mine because I have endured here. If I leave, I vanish." Her words lingered between them, as stark as the storm's howl. Elias sat slowly, the chair groaning beneath him. He rubbed his hands together as if to warm them, though the fire was strong. The two of them sat facing the flames, shadows trembling across the walls. The storm outside battered the world, but inside, a quieter storm settled. The realization that each of them lived as remnants, survivors of something that had already taken too much. His loss carried by memory, hers carried by survival. Neither spoke again. They did not need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of truths laid bare, truths too heavy to vanish with words. The fire crackled. The rain drummed, and in the cabin, 2 souls haunted by absence sat together, each one seeing in the other a reflection too familiar to ignore. The first snow came without warning. Clouds gathered in the north, heavy as stone, and by nightfall the world had vanished in a pale roar. The wind drove drifts against the door, rattled the shutters like bones, and sealed the cabin in a white silence that seemed endless. Elias Crowe woke before dawn, the air sharp with cold, his breath fogging in the dimness. He dressed heavy, pulled his boots on, and set to splitting wood. The axe rang against frozen logs, steady as a bell toll. Inside, Nayeli tended the fire. She moved slowly, conserving strength, wrapping her shawl tighter as the cabin's timbers groaned under the storm's weight. When Elias returned, his beard stiff with frost, she was at the hearth boiling coffee. The smell was bitter, dark, alive. She poured it into tin cups, and the brew was strong enough to sear through silence itself. He drank without complaint, though the taste carried a bite. She sipped hers in stillness, as if the bitterness was a familiar companion. The storm did not break. It raged through the day and into the next, shutting them within walls barely wide enough for 2 souls wary of each other. At first the quiet pressed on them like a burden. Elias sat sharpening his knife, the scrape of steel on stone rhythmic. Nayeli stitched a tear in her shawl with thread pulled from old cloth. They did not look at one another. Yet necessity softened the edges. By the second night, the food was shared without question. She placed dried meat in the pot. He cut it smaller so it might last. They ate together, the firelight painting their faces in shifting copper and shadow. And when the kettle hissed low, he poured water, and she spoke softly, her voice the first sound above the storm. "My father once said storms are spirits," she murmured. "They come to test us, to see what we will break or what we will save." Elias considered her words, his rough hands around the tin cup. "Then maybe it's a spirit I've earned. I've broken enough already." He did not mean to say so much, but the storm seemed to pry words loose, the way wind pries bark from trees. Nayeli did not press him. Instead, she watched the flames. Yet she noticed the way he still set 2 cups at the table, though only one woman lay in the earth. She said nothing, but the gesture lived in her heart longer than any words could. For his part, Elias noticed her scar. A long mark across the back of her hand, pale against her skin, the kind that comes not from accident but from battle. She tried to keep it hidden, fingers curling when she worked, but when she stretched her hand near the firelight, the scar told its story. A life defended alone, a life endured without shield. Days passed, the storm relentless. The wind screamed like a choir of the lost, snow piling high. Their silences grew easier, the weight less heavy. Not comfort, not yet, but a kind of fragile truce. It was the third night when the knock came, a hard rap against the door, nearly swallowed by the wind. Elias rose at once, rifle in hand. Nayeli froze, her braid slipping loose over her shoulder. He opened the door a crack, and the storm shoved cold air inside along with a man. The stranger was lean, gaunt-faced, his coat torn and dusted with snow. He smiled with a hollow hunger, his eyes darting quick. "Evening," he drawled, though his teeth chattered. "Storm's near to killing me out there. Reckon you'd let me warm myself a spell?" Elias studied him a moment, then stepped aside. "Storm don't care who it buries. Come in!" The man entered, stamping his boots, shaking off flakes. His eyes scanned the cabin quick, the hearth, the food, and then Nayeli. His smile sharpened. "Didn't reckon a rancher out here would keep company like this." Nayeli straightened, her shawl drawn tight, eyes fixed on him without flinch. Elias felt the air sharpen. "Company's mine to keep," he said, his tone flat. The stranger moved closer to the fire, holding his hands out. He leaned toward Nayeli with a look that held more interest than decency. "Apache, ain't you? Storm or no storm, can't say I've seen one kept in a cabin like this. Must be something to it." His eyes lingered, crude and cutting. Before Nayeli could answer, Elias stepped between them. His rifle hung easy in his grip, not raised, but steady enough that the meaning was plain. His voice was calm, but it carried iron. "You'll find warmth enough at the fire, stranger." "But that's all you'll find here." The man laughed low, though unease flickered in his eyes. He muttered something under his breath, but after a few minutes, warming his hands, he tugged his coat close again. "Storm's easing. I'll be on." He cast one last look toward Nayeli, then shouldered the door open and vanished into the white. Elias barred the door after him. The wind rattled it in protest, but the latch held. He turned back to the fire. Nayeli's face was calm, but her hands were tight on the edge of her shawl. "You didn't have to," she began. "I did," Elias said, cutting her off with quiet certainty. For a long time they said nothing more. The storm still raged outside, but inside something had shifted. A fragile trust, born not of choice, but of danger. Elias saw her not merely as a trespasser, not merely as the ghost of another life, but as a woman who deserved safety within these walls. And Nayeli, watching the way he stood between her and the world, began to see him not as a threat, but as a man whose silence hid a shield. The storm outside howled without mercy, but within the cabin the silence was warmer. The snow began to soften beneath the sun, retreating in rivulets down the slopes and leaving the prairie raw and wet. The thaw came not as a blessing but as an unease, for with it came the return of eyes, of whispers, of the restless tongues of men who had nothing but suspicion to warm them. Elias Crowe rode into town one morning to fetch supplies. The streets were thick with mud, the boards of the mercantile damp and groaning. He tied his mare and stepped through the door, his hat low, his list of goods folded in his hand. At first it was the same as ever, barrels stacked, sacks of flour torn and patched, the bell above the door ringing tired. But then the silence came. It began with a glance from the clerk, then the murmur of voices. A rancher living with an Apache woman. Elias heard it in the way words stopped short when he walked past, in the tightness of jaws, in the spit that darkened the mud outside. He ignored it, kept his shoulders square, his voice even. But when he carried the sacks back to his horse, he felt the weight of stairs pressing between his shoulders. Nayeli sensed it too. She had not stepped into town, but she read it in the way Elias returned, his jaw clenched, his silence harder than usual. She saw it in the set of his boots by the door, mud thick and angry. She did not need to hear the whispers. She had lived long enough to know the shape of disdain. At the cabin, the air thickened. Work went on. Elias mended fences that the thaw had loosened. Nayeli washed their garments in the stream and set them to dry on lines swaying in the cold wind. Yet beneath each motion lay a question neither dared ask aloud. Could two lives such as theirs meet without tearing something in the fabric of both? Elias carried the conflict like a stone in his chest. He wanted to protect her, but he felt the edges of reputation, the way the town's suspicion wrapped itself around his name. He thought of his wife, buried beneath frozen earth, and wondered if he was dishonoring her memory by letting another woman's shawl rest by the hearth. At night, when he turned in his bed, the emptiness beside him felt heavier for Nayeli's presence across the room. Nayeli, too, bore her pride like armor. She would not be pitied. Her silence was deliberate, her distance chosen. Yet small acts betrayed her. When Elias returned from the cold, his coffee was always poured, steaming on the table, though she never spoke of it. When his sleeve tore on barbed wire, she mended it, leaving no word but a thread finer than his eyes could manage. She tended to the hearth with care, not for him, but for the space they unwillingly shared. Still, her eyes held distance, as if daring him to mistake kindness for surrender. It was under a restless sky that the clash finally came. Clouds rolled above, swollen with rain, the air sharp with a storm that would not yet break. Elias came in from the fields, his hands raw, his face stern. Nayeli sat near the fire, braiding her hair with slow, deliberate movements. "You keep too many secrets," he said at last, his voice low but cutting. Her fingers stilled, the braid slipping loose. "What secrets do you think I keep? You never speak of where you came from, of who you lost. You stay silent while folks in town turn their mouths against us. I stand between you and their spit, but you keep yourself behind walls I can't reach." His hand tightened on the back of the chair. "How can I protect someone who won't let me in?" Nayeli turned to face him fully, her eyes fierce in the firelight. "Protect me?" The words were sharp, like flint against stone. "Your people's laws have taken enough. Land, names, lives. Protection is a word for men who believe themselves saviors. I do not need saving. I need only what I have earned. Breath, fire, a roof that does not collapse." The air cracked between them, sharp as a rifle shot. Elias's chest heaved, his anger burning not from her defiance but from the truth buried inside it. "I didn't ask for this war inside these walls," he said, his voice rough. "But it's here, and I can't stand in silence while the whole world calls you trespasser." Nayeli rose then, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "Then call me what you will. Trespasser, widow, ghost, it does not matter. My truth is survival. Yours is a past you refuse to bury. If that cannot live under the same roof, then perhaps this roof will fall." The storm outside broke in that moment, rain striking the roof in a sudden roar. The fire hissed, smoke curling up the chimney, as if the world itself bore witness to their words. For a long time, neither moved. Their anger hung in the cabin like smoke that would not clear. Yet beneath it, in the ache of their voices, lay something deeper, the fear of belonging. To admit care was to risk another loss. To admit need was to risk another abandonment. And so they struck with words, not because they hated, but because they feared to hope. Elias sat at last, his head bowed, his breath ragged. Nayeli turned back to the fire, her braid half finished, her shawl gathered once more around her shoulders. The rain hammered on, relentless. They were two souls bound by circumstance, held apart by pride, yet tied by something heavier than either wished to confess. And in the crack of thunder, they both understood unity would cost them dearly, but silence would cost them more. The wind carried it first, the acrid tang of smoke, sharp as iron on the tongue. Elias was out mending a fence line when he lifted his head and saw it, a black column rising on the horizon, twisting against the pale afternoon sky. The prairie wind was fierce, driving the flames faster than a horse could run. He dropped his tools and ran for the cabin. Nayeli was already at the door, shawl gathered tight, her eyes fixed on the growing blaze. The smoke swelled, a wall of darkness rolling toward them, and within it the crackling roar of fire consuming dry grass. "We'll lose it all," Elias muttered, breath tight in his chest. No, Nayeli answered, her voice steady. Not if we fight. There was no time for planning. They filled buckets at the trough, soaked blankets, and beat at the edges of the fire as it reached the fences. Heat blasted their faces, the smoke choking, eyes stinging. Elias's arms burned with the strain, each swing of the blanket heavy as iron. Beside him, Nayeli moved like a storm herself, her braid slipping loose, strands of black and silver flying as she struck again and again at the flames. The fire leapt the ditch, clawing closer to the cabin. Elias cursed, pulling water, choking on smoke. For a moment he thought they would lose. The prairie was too wide, the fire too hungry. But then Nayeli's voice cut through the roar. Here! Strike here! She flung a sodden blanket across a patch of flames crawling near the steps. Together they stamped it out, shoulders nearly touching, their movements desperate yet in rhythm, as if the fire had forced them into one heartbeat. Hours seemed to pass in the span of minutes. By the time the last flame hissed and died, their arms were raw, their clothes soaked, their faces streaked with soot. The prairie lay blackened around them, smoke curling upward like judgment, but the cabin still stood, scarred but whole. They staggered to the steps, collapsed side by side, their chests heaving. The stars had risen unnoticed, cold and brilliant above the ruined land. For the first time neither spoke. The silence was not hostile now. It was relief, deep as the earth itself. Elias turned his head, watching Nayeli in the dim light of the stars. Her braid hung loose over her shoulder, strands falling across her face. Soot darkened her cheeks, but her eyes shone fierce, unbroken. He saw in her not a trespasser, not a shadow of conflict, but a woman who had faced the fire and had not faltered. You saved more than the cabin, he said quietly. Voice rough with smoke and truth. She met his gaze, uncertain. And you did not abandon me. The words struck deeper than she intended. Elias's chest ached. He thought of all the years spent in silence, of his wife buried in the cold ground, of the emptiness he had carried like a second skin. He thought of this cabin, bought as a place for his bones to rest, and how it had become a place alive with someone else's fire. I can't live in silence anymore, he admitted, his voice breaking. This place, it isn't a home without your laughter, without your shawl by the hearth, without you. Nayeli's hands trembled where they rested on her knees. She had known hunger, thirst, winters without fire, but nothing had frightened her like love. Love had taken her family, her people, her place in the world. To give her heart again felt like placing it in the fire itself. I feared love more than hunger, she whispered. Hunger I can fight, silence I can endure, but love is where I was broken. Her breath shuddered, her eyes lowering. Then she lifted them again, steady. And yet with you I feel seen. The night held its breath. The stars seemed closer, as if bending to listen. Elias reached out, not to claim, but to offer, his soot-stained hand resting open on the step between them. Slowly, Nayeli placed her hand in his, her scarred palm fitting against his calloused one. It was no grand embrace, no fevered kiss. It was a joining in quiet dignity, born not from sudden passion but from hours of smoke, labor, and silence shared. A vow without words. The prairie lay blackened, its grasses turned to ash, but in that ruin something new had begun. The fire had burned away what stood between them, pride, fear, walls built from years of loss. What remained was fragile but true. Elias tightened his grip gently, his voice low. Then let us build something the fire cannot take. Nayeli did not answer at once. She leaned her head back, gazing at the endless sky, and for the first time in years, her lips curved faintly. A smile not of triumph but of release. The night was raw. The air still heavy with smoke, but neither felt the weight of loneliness as before. They had fought the fire together, and together they had found that even in ash, life could take root again. The morning came clear and sharp, the prairie washed clean by the fire's passing. The air still carried the faint scent of smoke, but the horizon gleamed with a cold brightness, as if the world had been scoured. Elias stood at the fence line, his rifle slung across his shoulder. When he saw them, riders cresting the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the sun, dust trailed their horses. the sound of hooves carrying on the wind. Settlers. He knew the shape of their hats, the glint of iron in their hands. As they drew nearer, his gut tightened, though his stance did not waver. Nayeli stepped onto the porch, shawl drawn close, her eyes narrowing as she counted the riders. 6 men, faces set in grim resolve. They reined in at the edge of the yard, their leader spitting into the dirt before he spoke. "You've got no right, Crowe," the man called, his voice hard. "That woman don't belong here." "You know it as well as we do." Elias shifted his rifle into his hands, steady as stone. "This cabin is mine. The land is mine, and no man tells me who I keep under my roof." "She's Apache," another voice cut in, laced with disdain. "Her kind has no claim. She's a trespasser, stealing what isn't hers." Nayeli's chin lifted, proud even as her heart pounded. Elias saw the fire in her, the same that had carried her through smoke and flame. He planted his boots firm in the soil. "Survival," he said, voice low but carrying, "is not theft. Dignity is not a crime. And I'll not stand by while men try to tear it away again." The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. The riders' hands twitched near their weapons. The air trembled with the threat of violence. Elias's rifle was steady, his eyes fixed, his whole body a line drawn in the dust. At last, the leader spat again, this time into the dirt between them. "You've made your choice, Crowe. Best hope it don't break you." He yanked his reins, and the others turned with him, their curses trailing on the wind as they rode off, their dust settling back to earth. Elias held his aim until they were gone from sight. Only then did he lower the rifle, his breath leaving him in a ragged gust. Behind him, Nayeli's hand tightened on the railing of the porch. For the first time in years, she felt the tremor of safety, not as a promise whispered and broken, but as something earned in defiance. The cabin stood quiet, the prairie vast around it. But they both knew silence would not last forever. The world beyond would not forget, nor forgive easily. That evening, as the last light faded, Elias spoke what had been forming in his chest all day. "We can't stay," he said. His voice was gentle, though it weighed heavy. "This cabin's been more than I thought it could be, but it was never meant to be the end." Nayeli turned from the hearth, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "It was a shelter," she agreed softly. "A place to remember who we are, but not where we must remain." Together they began to pack. Their hands moved without hurry, each item chosen with care. Elias gathered the old tools, worn handles polished by years of work, and his rifle, oiled and steady. Nayeli folded her shawl, laying it atop the bundle of garments she would carry. Elias slipped his wedding band from the shelf where it had rested, turning it once in his hand. He did not put it back on his finger. Instead, he placed it carefully into his satchel, not as grief, but as memory, a reminder of love that had shaped him, and of the chance to love again. When dawn broke, pale and cold, the two of them stood side by side, the cabin at their backs. They mounted their horses, Elias tall in the saddle, Nayeli's braids catching the wind. For a moment neither moved. They simply looked out across the horizon, the land stretching endless before them. It was not a promise of ease. The prairie was vast, full of hunger and hardship, but it no longer seemed empty. Together, the emptiness became possibility. As they rode forward, Elias felt a quiet peace settle in his chest. For the first time since the earth closed over his wife, he was not walking alone into silence. Beside him rode a woman who had faced fire and loss, who had endured abandonment, yet still carried dignity in the set of her shoulders. And Nayeli, her heart long a fortress, allowed herself to believe in second chances. The wind tugged at her shawl, braided strands brushing her cheek, and she did not turn back to the cabin. She had carried exile long enough. Now at last she chose the road. The prairie opened before them wide as eternity, and together they rode into it, two shadows moving forward side by side,